All right, for this next argument, we need to go back to the 18th century, which I'm sure you'll agree I did when I arrived in Texas a few days ago. Out there, they were just pure sport about it. It's awesome. I was worried. They've got guns. I was like, oh my goodness, can I drop this joke? That was good. It's good. Anyway, here we go. Premise one. I can tell that this pocket watch is a product of intelligence because of its sheer complexity, and it's got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that watches don't breathe. Premise two. You know what? I hope it's fairly clear that I'm a little bit more complex than this watch. Conclusion. Therefore, I have someone who winds me up when I stop. Now, this argument is entirely won or lost on the first premise, which Paley and other proponents of intelligent design bolster with analogical reasoning. What they say is, whenever we see complexity, we immediately recognize it as something consciously created by an intelligent being. Now, to be fair to Billy, his argument was based on a genuine gap in our knowledge. We did not know how nature could conjure this kind of complexity. So fair enough, I can see why people were convinced of this. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think that the watchmaker analogy is the absolute best argument that theism has ever had. I totally get it. It's a very intuitive, powerful argument. However, there's this thing called evolution by natural selection that precisely explains how complexity can emerge naturally. Because of this, we know that the first premise is wrong and that the analogy is obviously false. It can't be correct because we know the first premise is wrong. We've got a rebutting defeater. Evolution by natural selection demonstrates how complexity can emerge naturally. But even before Darwin's voyage, Paley's argument was still and is an argument from ignorance because he asserted that the proposition of complexity emerging naturally must be false since we didn't know in his time of any complex things emerging naturally. David Hume, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and a few other clever cats were able to notice the appeal to ignorance fallacy, but most didn't, unfortunately. Now, there was a lesson to be learned here, right? Don't just jump on something where we have no examples of the contrary and then assert that we cannot have examples of the contrary. Big mistake. Don't do it again. So they did it again. Now, I'm pleased to say that most of the people out there knew who this wonderful chap is. It's John Adams, the second president of the United States. And my favorite quote from him is that mystery is made a convenient cover for absurdity. Theists, my fellow apes, love mystery, for mystery is the safe space for God. The Origin of Species wasn't published until 2 decades after Adams lived, so he had to deal with people treating complexity as if it's super mysterious. But as soon as complexity was no longer seen as mysterious, theists needed a new safe space of God, a new God of the gaps, and they found it.
Okay, before we find the new safe space, we're going to talk about this one. What do you think about this, Jonah?
Yeah, so we kind of touched on this when you were on my channel. Shameless plug there. That in Australia, the whole kind of debate around intelligent design and evolution and God just wasn't really a big issue for me. So it's not something that I've kind of grew up thinking about. So in church, they would talk about how atheists have problem explaining morality or whatever, but the kind of idea of biology just never was a big issue. I would disagree that the Watchmaker is the best argument that they had. I think that at the time, Thomas's arguments, like the 5 ways, were pretty good, especially like going off Aristotle's physics. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Would you agree that it was the best argument they had, or?
No, I don't think I would either. Like, I think I still would agree with you. Probably like the 5 ways, looking at things like change, like Aquinas' argument from like motion and things like that are probably better because they're more like, they just seem more like parsimonious and they're not just relying on like arguments from analogy or things like that. There's a lot more like going for them. So no, I'd agree with you.
Yeah. So even before, I also agree that Darwinian evolution is the best kind of rebuttal to a Watchmaker design argument. So I think what Hume talks about was pretty good, how if we can infer a good God as the hypothesis to explain this, we have like 10 other God hypotheses that could explain this. So maybe it's just an incompetent God who has to keep practicing making new worlds, or an evil God. There's heaps of other possible explanations for biological like life that are theistic, but not like typical perfect being theistic. Yeah. And there's also lots that Hume had to say. I think he explained the analogy problem quite well, Stephen, there. So I wouldn't really disagree with that. What would you say?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I wonder, because one of the things Steve's going to bring up a lot is he talked about this idea of like mystery being like the safe space for God. And it seems like to me, like he just appeals to like evolution, like all the time. And as far as I know, and I haven't like listened to all Steve's videos, but he hasn't really like elaborated on deeper into like which evolutionary theory does he hold to? Like, does he hold to like Darwin's idea of like evolution being like purely random, or maybe like a more modern model like a new like synthesis? Because it seems like there's also like among like I'm sure you'd agree, like yours as well. Like evolutionary biology knowledge is very limited, but like from what I understand, like among like evolutionary biologists, assuming like this theory is true, there's a wide debate on like is evolution actually random, and there's a lot of research and papers that are published to show that it's really not just this random process. And not that Steve claimed that, but like if there is teleology in even like evolutionary theory, that's going to lend some credence even towards like design in there. So it doesn't really kill design; it just pushes the question into a different direction.
Yeah, you could definitely grant that design favors theism. You could just put it in Bayesian terms, but I think that wanting to like phrase everything in a deductive argument is something that I think in the last like 50 years, philosophers of religion have been much better at talking about like comparing explanations and like Swinburne and stuff. So I think that I agree that biological life and everything does provide evidence for theism, but I'd want it not just in a syllogism.
Yeah,
before
no, I think I agree with you because I would agree like there's like if you look at how Steve like presented this argument, like there's reasonable objections that can be raised where you can be warranted in like not concluding that like we're the product of design. Like you can have a reasonable objection, doesn't mean it's true, but like I think it's possible, and that's why I agree with you. Like more like the Swinburnian approach to arguing, we're saying these things are more likely on certain hypotheses is probably a much better way forward with looking at these things. But I do like to bring this up just like to think about like when we're thinking about design, it's often claimed that like Darwin killed design arguments, and I just don't think that's true because like even if you grant evolutionary theory, there's a lot of like hints of teleology in that, like the nature of like convergence, and like my interview with like Zachary Adern, we talked a lot about that too as well. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, and if people are interested, Graham Oppie has a cool paper. I forget the title. It's something along the lines of, if we wanted to kill design arguments, it must be Hume, not Darwin. Something like that is the title. Yeah.
Huh. I didn't know that Oppie had a paper on that. That's super cool.
Yeah. It's from like the 90s. It's pretty old, but
dang,
it was good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll check that out. Look at this one. We probably won't have too much to add because it's very similar. But yeah.
What they've done is they've taken the watchmaker analogy and replaced complexity with language and organisms with the genetic code. Boom. Checkmate. Once again, game over. Atheist, you're going to hell. And for the record, language here is defined as a signal-based communication system, and the genetic code certainly qualifies per this definition. John Perry, I can hear you. I can hear you out there telling me, get this across to the atheist community. I'm with you. And not surprisingly, proponents of this argument employ the same analogical reasoning as Paley. They say that whenever we see language, we immediately recognize the symbols as something consciously written by an intelligent being. Okay, objections. Let's get to it. Some of us have learned from history what an argument from ignorance is. Why is this an argument from ignorance? Well, it's because proponents are asserting that the proposition of language emerging naturally must be false, since we don't know how language can emerge naturally. It's precisely the same thing that was happening with the watchmaker analogy. And here's a second objection. We can approach it via coevolution. Language, as defined as a signal-based communication system, is the product of evolution by natural selection. For instance, plants signal to bees that they have nectar and pollen, and bees then carry pollen to other plants. And because of this, both of their survival chances increase. Definitely going to move on because I'm running out of time. I've got 6,000 slides.
Okay, what do you want to say here, Jono, if anything?
Well, his definition of a language I thought was interesting. Maybe it's just me being a bit slow, but I couldn't really understand what he was getting at. A signal-based communication system. So if I'm like playing pool and one ball hits the other ball and then that hits the other ball, is that communicating via signals, or is that... Yeah. I'd want to know what a signal and what communication is. But if he hadn't given a definition, I would say that there's an equivocation on the use of the word language. It's almost like C.S. Lewis's moral argument. So like if we have moral laws, where's the moral lawgiver, just like in a court? Because the sense of moral law versus human law is different. So that's what I'd say about me and you speaking the language English versus the language of DNA. But because of his definition of language, I'm just confused. So
yeah. I definitely didn't pay as much attention to how he defined language. I mean, I don't have much else to add here beyond like DNA. Like even like if the theist, like if you're a theist and you like, even if you want to like say grant like evolution, that still doesn't kill like arguments from DNA. Because like what if evolution's like has a lot of like teleology in it, is like some people think, and there's like these open questions, and this is why like Bayesian formulations are just better, because you don't have to like say only this hypothesis can explain this, because it's just this is a lot more, I think, helpful for like trying to look at like, is there a God? So
let me just add one thing on that. I liked what you said. I think the best teleological argument for theism isn't pointing to certain features of design, but it's kind of like Aquinas' is his fourth way or his fifth way, where kind of the whole concept of teleology favors theism. I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah.
And Rob Coons has done work on that, so people
Yeah.
can check him out.
I have to check that out. Yeah, I like kind of like design arguments, like where you just look at like the whole facts of like saying like maybe like there's embodied conscious moral agents, and you can like lump in maybe like fine tuning and like all these different things and say like what explains this better. And not saying that like atheism can't explain these things, just that like theism does a better job is kind of like what I would say. So